Welcome to Fellas, Finance and Philosophy. I'm Aiden Dobson.
I'm Dan Gorman.
I'm Legend Land.
And I'm Aiden Jersey.
And today we'll be diving into a practice that's causing quite a buzz and a whole lot more anxiety across Wall Street. Today we're talking about JP Morgan's monitoring of employees' keystrokes, Zoom activity, and even their badges.
Yeah, on paper this is really being marketed as a wellness initiative meant to prevent burnout and ensure fair working hours. But from what some analysts are saying, it is more like having a big brother in banking.
Exactly. These companies are presenting it as a tool to help employees better manage their workload, but the constant monitoring makes workers feel like they're being watched at all times. This makes it an extremely complex and interesting ethical problem.
And that's why we're here today, to ultimately tackle this issue through a number of philosophical lenses. We're not merely discussing whether it's an effective practice or not. We're going to really get into the nitty-gritty of the morality of this all.
So today we're going to analyze this practice through two ethical perspectives. First, deontology, which looks at whether the action itself is morally correct regardless of the consequences. Then we'll look at it through the lens of consequentialism, which examines the outcomes of the practice and whether the results justify the action.
Yeah, we'll also compare these perspectives to see where they agree, where they clash, and how companies like JP Morgan can find a middle ground which respects ethics while still maximizing their profits.
Also, because this isn't just another hypothetical trolley problem and instead affects real employees, we'll touch on some of the broader industry implications later.
So whether you're an anxiety-ridden junior analyst, an angry manager, or simply someone that's interested in the workplace ethics, you're going to want to stick around to hear more about why digital monitoring matters more than most people realize.
So let's start with the practice itself. There's been a lot of information coming out recently about big banks such as JP Morgan having dashboards like Workplace 360 that track activity across keyboards, Zoom logs, and their office entry. But the goal of these practices is supposedly to enhance workplace efficiency and analyst wellness, but that just sounds like surveillance to me.
Exactly. I think that's what's ultimately making people pretty uncomfortable. It's not just monitoring employees to see if they're doing their job, but it's more like the banks are watching the employees do their job at every second, to the point where they make decisions on their performance, which just doesn't really sit right with me.
Yeah, and like you said, these companies are really trying to frame it in a very positive way. They cite improved efficiency and identifying people who are overworked as kind of the main reasons. But I agree, it still feels super controlling.
Yeah, and there's just such a buzz around this topic right now because there's definitely a difference between supporting your employees and monitoring them. When you look at it from a practical perspective, it probably does actually help the bank. But when we consider it from an ethical lens, it definitely seems like more of a gray area here.
Yeah, exactly. So let's jump into it. Like we said, our first view is to look at this idea through a deontological lens. So deontology is all about whether the action itself is inherently right or wrong, regardless of the outcome. And this idea was developed by a philosopher named Immanuel Kant, who believed that an action is ethical for everyone or it is not ethical for anyone.
So how do we apply that to monitoring of employees then?
Well, to me, I think we need to start by asking what the actual action here is. It's not just improving productivity. It's effectively tracking people's behavior in a very detailed way, sometimes without them fully realizing how much they're being monitored.
Right, and I think that's the distinction that matters, because from a deontological standpoint, your intention doesn't automatically justify your actions. So even if the goal is efficiency or burnout prevention, we still have to ask ourselves if the constant monitoring and limiting of employees' privacy is the right thing to do. More specifically, this raises the issue of autonomy and consent. Even if employees technically agree to these policies, it's not meaningful consent as your job depends on it. From Kant's perspective, that undermines the ideas that individuals are making free, rational choices.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Kant would agree that employees are really just people in general should be treated as ends rather than just a means to an end.
I mean, in my mind, it makes it feel like you're just a number or a robot at that point. Kind of like your value is based on how active you look on a screen.
I feel like that also takes away all the trust to you. Like instead of assuming you'll do your job, they're basically just checking up on you constantly.
Right, that's where deontology would have a problem with it. The idea is really that people should be respected and trusted, and being controlled and monitored at all times kind of directly goes against this.
There's also the categorical imperative, which basically asks, what if everyone did this? Could we accept a world where every single employee constantly monitors every other employee's behavior? In that kind of world, trust between employers and employees would completely erode. And if trust disappears as a norm, then the practice actually contradicts the system it relies on function, failing the text of universalizability.
If you ask me, it kind of sounds like a communist regime.
Yeah, so according to Kant, if we can't reasonably universalize the behavior, then it is morally unacceptable.
Yeah, that's a fair counterpoint. I will say that there is something called a duty of fidelity, which means that employees have an obligation to fulfill their responsibilities and be truthful in their work. So in that sense, monitoring could be seen as just ensuring that that duty is upheld.
Even then, though, deontology would push back. It would say that how you enforce that duty matters just as much as the duty itself. If you rely on surveillance instead of trust, you're still violating a person's dignity.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the key takeaway from a deontological perspective. This kind of monitoring is just problematic because of what it represents. As we've discussed, it treats employees more as a means of productivity rather than individuals who are deserving of respect and their own autonomy.
Yeah, so shifting to the other perspective, if we take a consequentialist outlook on this practice, we have to solely focus on the results of the action. Based on the results, we have to take a utilitarian approach and essentially focus on the utility and disutility of the results.
So basically, we'll have to take a look at the positive outcomes, otherwise known as the action's utility, and compare that to the negative outcomes, or disutility.
Yes, and by doing this, we can observe the net utility. The challenge is weighing the long-term consequences and the short-term ones and using both to calculate this net utility.
Yeah, so to apply this to the lens of JP Morgan's monitoring system, the utility derives from the firm's ability to ensure proficiency from its employees. All employees would be forced to work.
Get rid of those workplace phantoms, dude.
Exactly. And JP Morgan would love to maximize shareholder value in any way. Martin Shkreli would low-key be a big fan of this.
We can't forget about the disutility, though. The monitoring system is bound to cause increased employee stress and much higher turnover rates.
Can investment banking even get higher turnover rates than it already has?
Better yet, this could cause the workplace phantoms to be performative grinders, hitting keys, highlighting and selecting random Excel files just to appear as if they're working. Very similar to that Wells Fargo case just a few months ago. This creates a fake sense of productivity, so even the supposed benefits might not be as strong as they initially appear.
So, although the profits are driven up in the short term, the culture is destroyed even more in the long term.
Using this utilitarian calculus, we can also weigh the extent of pleasure or pain to the firm and employees. According to the greatest happiness principle, the action that promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people is the action we ought to perform.
Oh, wow. So then that technically means, since the greatest number of people affected positively in this scenario is the shareholders, then the pain experienced by the employees of JP Morgan is insignificant?
Well, that's assuming that employees' trust and work culture is only a short-term issue. We already stated that it's a long-term issue. So hypothetically, hurting all current and future JP Morgan employees could affect the extent of pain and could even eventually hurt the shareholders' ability to grow profits further down the line. In this case, the correct choice would be to avoid monitoring workers' activity. We'd like to take a moment and pump the brakes on the philosophical jibber-jabber and let our sponsor, Dr. Squatch, take it away. Look, the end goal is looking like $1 million while pulling a 100-hour work week. The most efficient means to maximizing your net and utility is the Dr. Squatch X Sydney Sweeney Silk and Sandstone collection. Because the only consequence of a late-night model should be smelling like an absolute god. If you're looking for a good outcome, it starts with Dr. Squatch. Huge thanks to Dr. Squatch for keeping the lights on and ensuring we stay free on all platforms. Because of their generous backing, we're able to give you all the weekly scoop on what's popping in finance, the philosophical foundations of the daily grind, to ensure you, all the fellas and fellettes, are primed for your everyday finance life.
Now back to our regularly scheduled program. I'm definitely going to get me a bar of that soap. It's time to compare these two perspectives. Both of these lenses actually converge on the issue of trust, but they get there from completely different directions. Deontology assumes that trust is a moral requirement, as you owe it to your employees because they're human beings with inherent dignity. Whereas consequentialism is looking at trust as a variable in an equation. It doesn't care if trust is right or wrong in a vacuum. It only cares that a lack of trust eventually leads to a high turnover rate and a toxic culture, which kills the bottom line. So, there is a clear disagreement on the short-term justification between each lens. A consequentialist might argue that a few months of surveillance is a small price to pay for immediate efficiency gains and burnout data. But a deontologist would reject that entirely. They'd say the action is inherently predatory regardless of the data you get out of it. So, how do we actually resolve that tension? If we were JP Morgan, is there even a middle ground that could respect the analyst as a person while still giving the bank the data it needs? I think the resolution relies in the transparency and opt-in for the analysts. If the bank moves away from passive surveillance and towards voluntary data sharing, the ethical calculus shifts. When an analyst chooses to share their workflow logs to prove they're hitting that 80-hour cap and need a pencils down weekend, you're finally respecting their autonomy. And that's where the key is. You satisfy the deontological standpoint because you're treating them as rational analysts who can give meaningful consent. And you satisfy the consequentialist side because you're still getting the data to optimize the bank, but without the big brother energy that triggers a massive loss of trust. You resolve the tension by moving from tackling to collaborating with each other, and it turns this digital lease into a resource management tool. That way, the means are morally sound and the ends are actually sustainable for the long-term health of the company.
All right, so let's zoom out and look at the cultural and industry implications of this all. If we're being real, the Big Brother vibes aren't just an HR problem, they're a brand problem. No matter how many slide decks call this wellness, junior bankers see right through the corporate jargon. To them, it's digital micromanagement and an absolute vibe killer for someone who's already grinding 100 hours a week, which is unfathomable.
It really is. And from an industry standpoint, this creates a massive competitive disadvantage. If you're a top tier analyst, one of those absolute hammers who consistently delivers your value and your autonomy, you aren't going to put up with the digital leash that JP Morgan has on you, especially when you could easily jump ship to a boutique or a competitor like Goldman that still places more trust on their analysts.
Exactly. We're talking about a serious brain drain. If I'm an analyst, I'm sitting here thinking, if you trust me to model a $10 billion merger, why don't you trust me to manage my own mouse movements? From a consequentialist view, those efficiency gains mean nothing if your best talent flees. You end up where the only people left are the ones who don't have better options to turn to.
Yeah, and that's where the deontological failure becomes really a business failure. Once you've lost that ethical credibility by treating your team like toddlers, you can't just buy that trust back with a bigger bonus. You fundamentally change the nature of the manager-analyst relationship from professional leadership to a surveillance state.
Right. It turns a prestigious firm into a surveillance data factory, which doesn't really work when your only asset is your people. If you treat them like another data point, these companies shouldn't be surprised when the analysts start treating the firm like another stepping stone. And I hate to be that guy, but we are running low on time here. So what's our final verdict on JP Morgan's surveillance through these philosophical lenses we've been discussing today?
Yeah, from a deontological standpoint, the verdict is a hard no. Really, monitoring every movement is inherently unethical because it treats young professionals as tools and not people. It fails the test of universalizability. A world where everyone is constantly watched is a world where trust is dead, and that is a moral dead end.
And even if you're a results-only consequentialist, it's still incredibly hard to justify. Sure, there are short-term productivity spikes, but long-term burnout, fake work, and losing your best talent creates a net negative. In the end, the system is harmful to both the employees and the firm's long-term growth.
And that really highlights the tension that we've discussed today. When firms chase metrics while ignoring human impact, it ultimately creates a ticking time bomb of disaster. You can't build a premium culture on a foundation of surveillance.
Exactly. The real solution isn't better algorithms for these companies. Instead, it's building a healthy culture through communication and responsible data collection. Respecting an analyst's autonomy is the only sustainable way to run a successful business in the long term.
Yeah, also because once trust is broken, it's not just a morale issue anymore. It affects really the bank's credibility and limits both their employee retention as well as their hiring for the future.
Honestly, I think it's as simple as this. Firms that cultivate respect always see better efficiency in the long run. A trusted analyst is always more productive than one that feels like they're being watched by a computer.
So for our listeners, whether you're designing policies or just starting your career, remember that ethical practices must guide your metrics, not the other way around.
Yeah, so thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Fellas, Finance, and Philosophy. We hope this gave you guys some real food for thought for your next modeling session. Make sure to tune in next week as we discuss the upper deck implications of zinning in the workplace, featuring a special guest, Good Work.